I will officially begin the JCRC's second in a series. My name is Lindsay Mintz, and I am honored to be the JCRC's Executive Director. The JCRC is the Jewish community's policy arm, interfaith and intergroup relations arm. David Sklar, who is our assistant director, has been registered as our Jewish community's lobbyist for 13 years. So we also maintain relationships with elected officials and civic leaders. And we connect the Jewish community to the community at large, and the community at large back to the Jewish community. And we are a staff of 4 and have representatives on our board of directors from the different synagogues and agencies within the Jewish community. So we are where the Jewish community comes together. And there is a lot of diversity within the Jewish community on a lot of issues. And then there are some that consistently over time, there is near unanimity. And the obligation to participate in civic affairs is across the board within the Jewish community. The members of the Jewish community vote in some of the highest percentages among all groups in the United States, and that's been true for over 150 years. And I'm sure it'll be true this year as we approach our primary election and then our general election in November. So in any year, a conversation around access to the vote, difficulty for some groups to access the vote, our support of the Voting Rights Act, all of those things would be a conversation worth having in any year, and certainly in any election year, but particularly this year, as we all grapple with the challenges of the pandemic and want to socially distance and want to be safe and healthy. We thought it was really important to bring some of our civic leaders and elected leaders into a conversation with the Jewish community. And that's all I'll say as far as the opening, because I know that our moderator will also have a few words to share. I'm really delighted that Eli Isaacs is going to be moderating today's conversation and introducing our speakers and also managing the Q&A. He's going to be juggling a few things at once. Eli has been a JCRC board member for probably going on 4 or 5 years at this point, and is currently serving as the co-chair of our Government and Domestic Affairs Committee. And he is practicing at Fager Baker Daniels, correct? I should have your bio in front of me.
Fager, Drinker, Biddle, and Reed.
Oy vey. Okay. I don't have the bio in front of me. I apologize, Eli, and to your employers. I'm going to hand it over to you, Eli. Thank you for moderating our conversation today and taking us through this important discussion.
Thank you, Lindsay, for the introduction, and I'm thrilled to be moderating today. As Lindsay mentioned, this is the second of our JCRC Talks programs. We're trying to bring civic and government leaders together to give us updates on timely items that impact the Jewish community and the community at large. As Lindsay mentioned, elections and access to voting, though not uniquely a Jewish issue, have always been kind of near and dear to the heart and the core mission of what the JCRC does. This year in particular, according to my notes, there is a pandemic occurring. Will be a little bit unique and challenging, so we thought this time would be well spent with some civic leaders talking about what we're doing to allow for safe and secure primary and general elections, and what discussions, proposals, and debates are ongoing to maintain and increase access to the polls. So I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. I'll do brief introductions for each of them, and then we'll let each panelist speak for 5 to 7 minutes or so on the topics of the day. And then after that, we'll open it to questions and answers. I will moderate that portion as well. When you have questions, please submit them via the Q&A button which should be at the bottom of your screen, and I'll get to them in turn to ask our panelists. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce, we'll start with Clerk Mila Eldridge. Mila Eldridge was elected to be Marion County Clerk in 2014. She's served in the clerk's office in various capacities since 2007. Prior to her election, she served as a team leader and managing special outreach programs for the clerk's office, including the Why Vote initiative for students, the Voter Experience Project, and the voter registration program for newly naturalized citizens. Mila was a director of the Marion County Election Board from January 2012 to July 2013, and deputy director from 2007 to 2012. From 2001 to 2006, she served the city of Indianapolis as an executive associate in economic development and cultural tourism. That was during the Bart Peterson administration. She also served in various capacities in the O'Bannon and Joe Kernan gubernatorial administrations. So thank you for joining us, Mila.
Thank you.
Our second panel.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, thank you. Our second panelist is Bill Moreau, who is of council retired at Barnes & Thornburg. As chair of Barnes & Thornburg's Interdisciplinary Higher Education Practice Group, Bill led a team of more than 50 lawyers firm-wide who regularly represented traditional nonprofit colleges and universities on the vast array of issues they confront daily. He's served as a trustee at Purdue University, chairing the university's finance committee. Bill also maintains an extensive government affairs practice involved in representing clients before countless local, state, and national administrative, executive, legislative, and regulatory bodies. Maybe most importantly for this conversation, he is a co-founding board member of the Indiana Citizen Project, which he'll tell us more about when he speaks. Finally, rounding out our panel this afternoon is Trevor Foudy, who's the Associate Vice President of State Relations for Indiana University. As Associate Vice President at IU, Trevor is responsible for leading Indiana University's state legislative priorities. Prior to his work at the university, Trevor spent nearly 15 years working in Indiana politics and government, holding communications positions with former Governor Mitch Daniels and the Indiana Republican Party. Trevor served as Deputy Chief of Staff for then Representative Todd Young, and then managed now Senator Todd Young's Senate campaign in 2016. Trevor, as with Bill, is a co-founding board member of the Indiana Citizen Project. So thank you all again. With that, I will get out of the way until the Q&A portion, and I'll hand things off to Mila.
Thank you, Eli. As you can see, I'm still adjusting to the new world of virtual Zoom meetings. So bear with me if I do something that is out of the norm, because we are definitely getting used to what possibly could be the new norm. So I am so thankful and honored to be a panelist today. I would like to thank Lindsay and the JCRC for everything that you all do, and also just for the invite to be a panelist for this virtual town hall. We are definitely dealing with some unprecedented times, right? It's amazing how COVID-19 has literally turned our world, our nation, our country, upside down. COVID-19 has had an impact on every area of our life, economically, our educational system, our healthcare system, and our political system. Like I've been trying to think of an area that COVID-19 has not had an impact on. And in regard to the election, it has definitely been challenging under COVID-19 due to the fact that we have to maintain social distancing and maintain not being in large gatherings. So that is a challenge alone, even when it comes to the administrative piece for like pre-election. That is very challenging. However, it is critical though that we do the things that we are supposed to do in regard to continuing to abide by the CDC rules under COVID-19 and our health professionals. And for Marion County, what we did, we actually mailed an absentee application to every registered voter in Marion County. We just felt that that was the most safest way to not add to the health crisis and not to make it worse. Now, with that being said, we have received an overwhelming, a very high volume of absentee applications, but that is the safest way to vote right now. However, a voter can still vote in person on election day or prior to election day if they choose to do so. And we have actually, we're going to make sure that people are safe. That's the voters, that is our volunteers, everyone that is working. I'm actually at our Election Board Service Center now, and we're making sure that everyone wears a mask. We have plenty of PPE equipment, but for this election, I can't stress how important it is that we don't forget that we are still dealing with a pandemic and a crisis, and that we must implement social distancing, washing our hands, wearing the mask, wearing gloves, which is interesting that all that changes, it seems like, from day to day on what we need to do to be safe. But we're going to continue, like I said, just to make sure that voters and people in general are safe under the current amid pandemic.
Thank you very much. I think we'll turn it over to Bill for your initial thoughts.
Thank you. First of all, let me say what an honor it is to be on the same panel with Clerk Mila Eldridge. So in 2016, the term election security entered our vocabularies. Well, in 2015, the brand new clerk of Marion County went out and, with great foresight, procured an election system for Marion County, which obviates election security issues. Little did we know, as a result of the 2016 elections, that our fundamental safety of our elections might be compromised. But know that Mila Eldridge did something very courageous, really very early on in her term, with broad bipartisan support. And so the residents of Marion County, the voters of Marion County, can be absolutely certain that our voting system is secure. You've heard the term paper backup probably to describe voting systems. This is actually a paper in the forefront. I just wanted to give a shout out to Mila for her foresight in ensuring that our elections here in Marion County are secure. So now let me jump quickly into my presentation. And I hope you can see this little PowerPoint. I'll try to go through it quickly. And just to indicate that long before the state of Indiana and the country had a public health crisis, the state of Indiana has had a civic health crisis. So this is the 2019 edition of the Indiana Civic Health Index. It's been a project of the Indiana Bar Foundation. This is the fourth edition. And so the 2019 edition used 2018 data from across the country. It's actually census data. So I'm not able to advance the screen, which is a bummer. So I don't know quite what to do because somebody else has grabbed this. So Dave, if you can, I've got it back. So Indiana is stuck in the bottom 10 of states for turnout, and we're not doing much better for voter registration. We had a record turnout in 2018 during the midterms, so did the rest of the country. So we still finished 43rd. We weren't much better in 2016. We were 41st. not only are we not showing up, we're not terribly well informed when we do. This was a study released in 2019 based upon a national survey in 2018 in which the citizenship exam was administered to Americans. And you can see once again, the state of Indiana, we're stuck in the bottom 10 of states for civic literacy. So for the first time in the history of this publication, the Civic Health Index made a couple of recommendations. The first one was to do something about civic literacy, to convene a civic education task force, to spend 2020 working on our civic literacy challenge and report back at the end of 2020 with some recommendations. The second recommendation says that as we head toward the 2020 elections, Indiana should aspire to increase voting turnout substantially with the goal of moving from the bottom 10 to the top 10 of states, a very ambitious goal. So the Barr Foundation signed up for the first recommendation. You may know the Barr Foundation is the sponsor of the We the People program and many other very important civic literacy programs. Our little startup, the Indiana Citizen Education Foundation, signed up for recommendation number 2. And together we're working under an umbrella entity called the Indiana Civic Health Alliance. So the Civic Education Task Force has been convened. It's chaired by the Lieutenant Governor. It has representative of each of the 4 legislative caucuses. The Secretary of State is a member. Chief Justice is a member. Our teacher education institutions are represented as our school teachers. The Indiana Citizen, we exist to encourage Hoosiers to vote without caring how they'll vote, and importantly, connected to unbiased information about the candidates and the issues. So let me pause there for a second and break this apart. So we're trying to, on a completely nonpartisan basis, we're a 501c3. We're trying to encourage Hoosiers to vote without caring how they'll vote, which can be a radical, dangerous proposition for those in the political class. And importantly, we're building an information platform that will connect these new voters to unbiased information about the candidates and issues. So we're trying to mobilize a statewide effort to increase turnout by 20%. Connected to a digital registration platform, right? If you get to our landing page, you'll be able to go through and register to vote online through the Secretary of State's office. And we're going to try to provide as much unbiased information about the 2020 candidates' issues as we can put there. So at the end of 2019, we got a very generous grant to hire our first full-time employee. His name is Kevin Morgan. He spent most of his career at the Indianapolis Star. He was in charge of their voter guides. And quite recently, he was at the Indiana General Assembly as part of their information services. So our goal is to reach 750,000, that's right, 750,000 of the estimated 1.7 million Hoosiers in the voting eligible population who are as yet unregistered, provide a pathway for them to register, and then to follow up with them to provide unbiased information about the candidates on their individual ballot. So unbiased information of this kind is not available from any other known source in Indiana these days because of the decline of newspapers generally. So we're creating a digital voter guide like the local newspapers used to. In fact, we are about to announce a partnership with the Hoosier State Press Association and some 25 of their newspaper members to provide this kind of information to voters. So the deadline that really drives us is the voter registration deadline, October 5th. We're going to try to register 750,000 new voters with the goal of 600,000 of them showing up on election day. If we reach 3.4 million voter turnout in the general election in November, that will represent a 20% increase. Okay, how do we do this? So we hired a fellow by the name of Derek Feldman, who, thanks to a marriage, is living here in Indianapolis, but he spends much of his life when he could travel, living out of a suitcase as he traveled nationally and internationally to provide advice to such organizations as the Ad Council. Derek has been in charge of informing the Ad Council on how to motivate folks to register and vote. and he has special expertise in the thinking of millennials and Gen Zs. So we're going to target as many unregistered fellow Hoosiers as we can. High school seniors represent a particularly target-rich group, college students, rural, urban, every age demographic, because we have a big, lofty goal. So last week we launched our campaign. It's called the One More Voice campaign. It's the product of Derek Feldman's genius, along with a local ad agency by the name of Element 3. Urge you to go to onemorevoice.com and see how we're going to tailor this content to try to reach our fellow Hoosiers where they live. And with that, I'm going to pull back to the cover of the Civic Health Index. And for those of you who can squint hard, you can see that there are a number of logos on there that belong to various Indiana University entities. IU has been present at the birth of this publication, and no better person to represent IU in this discussion than Trevor Foudy, who also happens to be a member of the board of directors of the Indiana Citizen Education Foundation. Take it away, Trevor.
Thanks, Bill. I think that was a good overview. I don't have a whole lot to add. I think my role here today, like it is on the board, is just to be the Jiminy Cricket to your Pinocchio. Keep you headed in the right direction. But one point I do want to underscore, as I've talked with some of our researchers and experts at IU, I think it goes unnoticed a lot of times, but one of the biggest reasons why people don't show up to vote is that they feel uninformed about what the choices are. They may know who the candidates are at the top of the ticket, but as they get down ballot, they're not sure. And so a lot of times they don't go because they don't think it's responsible, or they just don't know who they're going to vote for. And so I think it's worth underscoring as part of our mission. Bill touched on this. It's not just finding people to register to vote and reminding them to go vote, but making sure they can find information about the various candidates. And so I think the whole idea of an online voter guide with profiles about each candidate and information about voting records for those who are already in office, I think is very helpful, more so than we often think, in terms of helping to increase our turnout numbers. So beyond that, on the IU side, Bill did note there were several that were listed. Probably chief among those right now is the IU Center on Representative Government, which previously was the Center on Congress, which Lee Hamilton started. Congressman Hamilton is still very involved with the Center on Representative Government. He's been involved with helping put together the Civic Health Index over 4 editions. And so we're excited to get to work on this project and the task force that Bill mentioned through a lot of different units at IU. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Eli.
Great. Thank you all so much. As a reminder, please submit questions as you have them through the Q&A feature, which should be available at the bottom of your screen. We've got a couple already. The first is directed to you, Mila. It's from Polly Spiegel, who I know is working actively on some of the vote by mail initiatives. Polly asks whether she notes that states that use proven vote by mail processes use the USPS standard envelopes and USPS barcode on ballot envelopes, so that both the election office and the voter can track where their ballot is at all times, which is, a defense against fraud and popular and useful. Can we expect the USPS intelligent barcode on our envelopes here in Indiana? Given the unprecedented volume of applications for this election, we think it would be useful, and it's likely we'll have the same volume or more during the November election.
We have seen for a primary election a very high volume of absentee application requests. Unbelievable, actually like 10 times more than the 2016 election. So I believe moving forward that we will definitely look into every option that we have to improve the process. It's funny how I said earlier, though, that the pandemic, how it impacted every area, you know, of our world. But some of the impact is a good impact because it has made us move forward and to operate and do things differently, right? So since we've learned from this primary election by mailing an absentee application to every registered voter, that it's good for the voters of Marion County. They like it. That we definitely will look into moving forward on how, especially for the November election, if we're still dealing with the same conditions or that we are right now, on how to improve the process. So we definitely would work with the U.S. Postal Service on tracking and whatever they have actually to offer to help us and our voters in Marion County for the November election.
And do you know, can you speak to, are there any barriers to being able to use that type of tracking, just logistical or otherwise?
I don't think there are any barriers. We would just have to make sure that statutorily that it is something that we can do. Marion County is very unique when it comes to the statute, but I don't see how that would cause or be a barrier for Marion County if we were to have some type of a tracking device or do more tracking in regard to voters that choose or have the option to vote by mail. So I don't foresee that as being a barrier.
Got it. Thank you very much. Next question for Bill and Trevor. Your presentation noted that Indiana Citizen, I guess, counted 1.7 million unregistered Hoosier voters. One of our participants noted that the U.S. Election Project estimates that the voting eligible population in Indiana is closer to around 5 million, and we have about 4.5 million registered voters. So just curious as to where that 1.7 million figure comes from.
Well, that's a great question. So every state's voter registration numbers are inflated. And no Secretary of State can tell you by how much, except to acknowledge that they are. And there are two ways to prove that without getting too deep into the weeds. But if you, in 2016, had taken the voting eligible population as the denominator and the number of votes of the number on the Secretary of State's office of the number of registered voters, you would come to the conclusion that 99% of the voting eligible population was registered in 2016, and we know that's not true. Instead, what we do is we rely, this is the second part, we rely on the data that comes out of the Civic Health Index. We take the percentage of folks who say that they were unregistered and multiply that by the voting eligible population, and that's how we get to 1.7.
And I'll just add, Bill, I just shared in the chat the link for the Civic Health Index for 2019, because I think that will be useful to help understand some of that as well.
Perfect. Thank you for clearing that up. Another question that I think is open to the whole panel is, you know, how can we, I think, meaning you within your roles and we as citizens, work to adopt a statewide mail-in voting system in Indiana, especially in light of the current times, or, you know, otherwise some no-fault absentee voting system?
How about I defer to the attorneys that are represented?
Well, Mila, yes. So this is a great question because it sort of permeates and overhangs the decision that was reached on a very bipartisan basis to move the primary from May to June and make the other associated changes. And without getting too far off track here, the way that was accomplished was there was an agreement on a bipartisan basis that the combined emergency powers of the governor, the secretary of state, and the Indiana Election Commission would permit it. So as we look ahead to the fall, you know, you would think that in order for no fault absentee balloting to occur in the fall, you would need to have some sort of emergency predicate. Meaning that if you go inside the Indiana Code, Title III of the Indiana Code, the elections part of the code, you would see that the General Assembly has specified 12 reasons why you would be eligible to get an absentee ballot, right? Those have been suspended by operation of these collective emergency powers. So if there isn't a public health emergency in the run-up to the November election, we can anticipate that the fall election will be, I'm using air quotes here, a normal election. And the reasons that you have to fit in one of those 12 categories would then apply again, right? Was that helpful? So now we're into 2021. We're in the General Assembly coming back in 2021. And I think it's a pretty safe prediction that there's going to be a very rich discussion in the General Assembly in 2021 about some of these really institutional changes, some of that need to be made in order to effectuate ease in voting.
Eli, if I could just add to what Bill said, I think it's just important to know that we don't make those decisions. It's up to our legislators over in the State House that makes those decisions. So I would advise anyone that is listening to talk to your legislator and share if you are for absentee voting by mail, or you think that it should be statewide, a law that the state of Indiana votes by mail only. I did lobby for an all-mail primary for Marion County just because of the numbers or the cases that we have seen in Marion County in regard to COVID-19, because again, I just felt that it was the safest way to keep people safe under the current pandemic. But if that is residents' request that we become an all-mail county, talk to your state legislators.
Thank you, Mila. It's sticking with you for a handful of questions on kind of technical processes for the upcoming elections in Marion County. I'm going to combine a few here. Has Marion County adopted or does it have plans to adopt some of the USPS resources that have been made available, including the 2020 election mail toolkit, the mail design analyst, the election mail coordinator? That's, I guess, question one. Number two is, what plans does the county have to purchase high-speed sorters to image signatures on ballot envelopes and make the signature process more efficient? And then the final is, are there plans to locate ballot drop boxes conveniently throughout the county? And then I guess one I would tack on to the end of those three technical questions is there anything else you want us to be aware of that the county's working on doing to make this process better, more efficient, and safer?
Those are all good questions. Again, those questions are coming from being if we were an all-mail county, right? So again, due to COVID-19 is the reason why the crisis, the emergency that we are under, is why we actually were able to eliminate reasons for people to vote absentee by mail. So all those are good questions. And however, after this election, we need to get through this election. We can sit down with Bill and our other partners and find out what is the best way, what for Marion County for our voting process? What does that look like? Again, we don't know what the new norm is going to look like. We're still dealing with the pandemic. So we're under a current health crisis. So again, those are all great questions, but those are questions that we're going to have to sit down and discuss and figure out, what does the voting process look like for Marion County? And again, always remember too that there are statutes that are out there that would have to be changed. Bill said it very well, how we got to where we are today in regard to every registered voter receiving an absentee application. That's out of the norm, you know, for the state of Indiana. So again, we would have to work with the Secretary of State, the governor, other county clerks. You know, there's a lot that goes into play with changes, and especially when it comes to politics or elections. So those are great questions, and moving forward, we will have to decide and see exactly what the election process will look like for Marion County. But I can't say right now because this is all new.
Yeah, no, totally appreciate it, and thank you for that context and answer. Another one for the full panel. Are there specific programs any of you have seen in other states that have been particularly successful at increasing voter turnout? And do you think they would work in Indiana? And then kind of as a follow-up question on that, because I know it's been a hot button topic for us for a while now. With respect to our polls, Indiana polls still closed at 6. How big a factor is that in your minds in terms of voter turnout?
Well, I'll take a shot at that. So, yeah, I've spent the last couple of years really trying to immerse myself in the art and science and mystery of how we motivate our fellow citizens to first register, of course, and then to vote. And as I mentioned in my presentation, thankfully, the person who knows more about that than anybody in the country, his name's Derek Feldman, and happens to live here in Indianapolis. And so he has spent much of the last several years of his life trying to work on these kinds of communication campaigns. And there have been many of them over the years. You know, think of Rock the Vote, for example. One of the defects in many of these registration and turnout campaigns is that they tend to have a partisan bias or an issue bias. There just haven't been too many of them that have been purely and strictly and scrupulously nonpartisan. But this is a moment in which I need to give a big shout out to the League of Women Voters and Common Cause, who've been working in this space long before my wife and I decided to do this in my retirement and recruit good people like Trevor to the cause. So this has been something that has been worked on very, very diligently. And I, at the risk of sounding like I'm giving a commercial for our campaign, maybe I am, I'm absolutely persuaded that this One More Voice campaign is the way to try to locate and engage our fellow citizens because of how flexible it is. Because you can think of any number of adjectives that you could put in one more voice, one more green voice, one more Vincennes voice, one more IU voice. And as we try to go out and we really try to target our fellow citizens who are as yet unregistered. And with regard to the question about our voting hours, 6 to 6. So you could make a list of some of the policy changes that Indiana might make. You could start with our voting hours. You could talk about mail-in voting. You could talk about automatic voter registration so that when you interact with the government, you're automatically registered to vote. And if you look at the states that are in the top 10 for turnout, those states have made those policy choices. But there have been a lot of really smart social scientists who tried to drill into any one of them to try to determine whether that's the silver bullet to increase turnout. Those kind of conclusions haven't yet been reached. But I've got to believe, and this is the optimist in me, I think if we really as a state really roll up our sleeves and try to do something about our abysmally low levels of registration and turnout, and we fall short, I think that's the predicate to a really rich conversation in the 2021 session of the General Assembly. Are we satisfied? Are we I mean, right, when I talk to folks, I'm sorry, I'm sort of doing a filibuster here, but we live in a political climate in which every fact becomes almost a Rorschach test. So when we confront people with the fact that we are in a state that's consistently in the bottom 10 of turnout, that elicits one of two responses. Only one of two responses. That's horrible and we ought to do something about it, or it's working for us. And by the way, that reaction extends to Democrats and Republicans. If you're the Lake County Democratic chairman, you think things are working pretty fine just the way they are, because you've been able to figure out who your voters are and how to get them to the polls. So we're trying to introduce what's been characterized as a third-party voice into this discussion, along with the League of Women Voters and along with Common Cause, and to try to raise the resources to put front and center whether we as a state ought to be satisfied with 1.7 million of our fellow citizens not participating. I'll shut up.
So, Eli, can I add to what
Yeah,
Bill?
sorry.
Okay.
We've got a handful of questions left that I don't think we're going to be able to get to, unfortunately. I do want to, in just kind of 10 seconds, if each panelist can answer one of the remaining questions, which is what can individual citizens do to try to break down some of these barriers most effectively? Is it writing our legislators? What can we do to help in the short term to try to get this addressed for voting this year in this pandemic?
I'll be very brief. I had the privilege of visiting Denver, Colorado, whose voter turnout is over 70% once they went to becoming an all-male state, right? So mailing an absentee application to every registered voter, definitely there is data that shows that it does improve or increase voter turnout. The operations is totally different than operations if you are doing it the old way. And the old way is manually with people. So there is equipment out there that can help with the operations if you were, or if a state were to go to an all-male primary. But you have to keep in mind that you have to, if you do that, and if the voter turnout increase is higher, you have to be able to accommodate that in order for us to get the information back in a timely manner, right? Because you have more people participating in the process. I will end my comments by saying that I think that we need to definitely look at same-day voter registration, Bill. I think that will help with voter turnout. We see that for a primary election in Marion County, the state of Indiana, we have already processed close to, if not, we're at 70,000 absentee applications and have mailed that many ballots already for a primary election in Marion County. And that is because I believe that we mailed an absentee application to every voter. Now, I do think that education is always going to be critical and key moving forward. Final comment is that we have registered voters. Even though that number may be inflated, Bill, we have registered voters. But we need part two. And part two of that is you register to vote, but not only do you register, you go to the polls and you vote and you educate yourself. So I think it's key that we continue the education. It's key that we continue to register votes. I think it's key that we need to continue to have conversations about same-day voter registration and continue to do things that will move Marion County forward and the state of Indiana with our election process. Thank you again so much for having me be a panelist for this town hall virtual meeting. I want everyone to continue to wash their hands, wear their masks, stay home, and be safe. Thank you.
Trevor, you go ahead. You try to add to that. Good luck.
I can't top that. But I will say, you know, legislature's good, but in terms of the election this year, and I'll speak to what the clerk said, we already have people that are registered to vote. I think without getting into the weeds too much, we didn't talk about what's sort of under the hood, but our website, I think, for the Indiana Citizen and the One More Voice campaign can be a great tool to make sure that your friends and family have up-to-date registration, but that they're getting information about the election. Our website is built in part on a platform called TurboVote, which powers the state's own online system. We were very fortunate that they agreed to work with us. They had to be convinced that we were truly a nonpartisan group. But when you go to our website to check your voter registration or to register, it's the exact same system that the state is using. And then you'll get reminders as we get closer to the election of where your polling place is, information about your ballot. I think that's the sort of information. And again, it's all automated once somebody just looks to make sure their status is correct on the site. So I think that can be a good resource to share that, whether it's through social media or emails to colleagues. I think that's a great way to help increase turnout this year.
Yeah, Eli, I just want to thank you for inviting me, giving us an opportunity to talk about our work, and just to amplify a point that Trevor just made. If we're successful in combining this technology in a way much smarter people than I are going to do, we'll actually be able to send to somebody who comes through our website an electronic version of their ballots. Their sample ballots, obviously not their actual ballot, their sample ballot before they go to vote. They'll be able to click on the names of their individual ballot, right? And get information about the candidates who will appear on their ballots. And that's a pretty exciting thing we're working on.
Great. Thank you all so much. This has been really great, and we really appreciate your time. I'll turn things over to Lindsay to wrap us up.
My thank you to Bill, Trevor, and Clerk Eldridge. I could listen to this conversation for a long time because, as you said, Trevor, when you start to look under the hood and just dig a little bit, if you look through questions or comments in our chats, this is not just an important conversation. It's really central in many ways to how we operate and exist as a country. And you can make a pretty solid argument that there's no better endeavor than this first right and this first obligation of citizenship, I would say also. And so, having you join us, Clerk Eldridge, and hearing you get fired up a little bit, like I want to hear you more, because we know that the system, like many systems, it's complicated. Some of it is local, some of it is state, some of it is regional. And sometimes complexity turns people off, especially when you think that it should be simple. If we see that X, Y, and Z is working in other states, why aren't we trying it here? But we also know, and as Hoosiers, it might be a little bit of a love-hate reality. We know that sometimes we have to fight pretty hard for some of the common sense policies that take a long time to enact here, and that's part of what JCRC does. We are in these conversations for the long haul, and sometimes it's incremental change, and we'll take it, and we will say thank you along the way. to citizen leaders, to elected leaders at all levels of state government, and know that whether it's the Indiana Citizen or League of Women Voters or Common Cause or your county clerk or the Secretary of State, all of, we need to all be engaged. And certainly members of the Jewish community recognize that responsibility, and not just for ourselves, but for all citizens. There are all sorts of layers to this conversation that the JCRC is interested in continuing. We know that 2020 is certainly a unique and challenging year that's going to, force us to make some changes. And that's some of the silver lining, and hopefully it will accelerate some of the changes we know that need to come our way. Until the next conversation, today is May 20th, and so we have a deadline coming up, correct? Tomorrow is one of the first deadlines. We've already passed the deadline to register for the primary, but tomorrow is the deadline. I don't want to misspeak. Clerk Eldridge, tell me what tomorrow's deadline is.
Tomorrow is the deadline for a voter to return their absentee application, and they have to physically return it to the election board by 11:59 tomorrow. We cannot accept applications that are submitted after tomorrow. So
it has to be postmarked by then?
Nope, we have to have them in our possession.
Received. And that's just the application. That's the application to get the ballot.
Absolutely. So we must have the application received tomorrow. A voter can bring their application to the Election Service Center located at 3737 East Sherman Drive. That's at the corner of Washington Street and East Sherman Drive. We're here from 8 a.m. until 8 p.m. and we are working weekends.
3737 East Sherman Drive by tomorrow night. This is the application if you want to vote by mail. And if you miss this, that you can still vote, obviously, but then you're going to have to socially distance and wear a mask and enter a physical poll for a primary.
If I could just have 1 minute just to say that voters can still vote in person. We will have in-person voting. We'll have 3 satellite locations for the primary election, and we'll have 22 vote centers open on election day, which is June the 2nd. So if a voter, for whatever reason, has an issue, or maybe they didn't receive their ballot, who knows what may happen, they still have the option to in-person vote. They just need to, again, be safe and wear PPE.
And I just want to confirm that I wrote down the correct address, 3737 East
Sherman Drive, the corner of Washington Street and Sherman Drive.
All right, wonderful. Okay, lots of information. Everybody pay attention, stay alert, do what we need to do to participate in this process. And thank you all for joining us today, and to our panelists for taking an hour out of your day, and to Eli Isaacs for hosting and moderating our conversation. We got you all out before the top of the hour. So wonderful. Be safe, be healthy, and yes, wash your hands. And
Thanks
vote.
for the invitation.
Oh,
And vote.
Thank you.
thank you. You guys be safe.